we have found over the years, in part through research done at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania, that when people in an organization feel disconnected from one another, that negatively affects their creativity, their productivity, and their engagement in the workplace. What we further found is that when people are disengaged in the workplace, that actually affects the people around them negatively. So if you are looking to enhance creativity and productivity in the workplace, if you want to ultimately do so in a way that contributes to retention in the workplace, then it's actually incumbent upon you to find ways to foster social connection in the workplace.
Hello and welcome to Franklin Covey on Leadership. I'm your host, Will Hodling. Today's guest is Dr. Vivek Murthy, a two-time Surgeon General who served under both Barack Obama and Joe Biden. At 37, Dr. Vivek Murthy became the youngest Surgeon General in history when he was nominated in 2014. Prior to becoming Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy trained at Harvard and Yale and founded Doctors for America. He's the author of the best-selling book, Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And as Surgeon General, he made loneliness and youth mental health a national conversation. Dr. Murthy, welcome to Franklin Covey on Leadership.
Hey, thanks so much, Will. It's good to be with you. And please call me Vivek. I'm informal.
Wonderful. So you have been in the public eye as Surgeon General twice. Why do you feel that it's important right now to be out there speaking to the community in different settings, joining podcasts like this? You're the first Surgeon General that we've had on, I'll say that much.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Hopefully I won't be the last. But, when I was in office, I came to understand really just through the conversations I was having with people all across the country, how deeply people were feeling a sense of concern about their health and well-being, a sense of emptiness, a lack of fulfillment. And they wanted better for themselves. They wanted better for their kids. And I may not be in uniform anymore, but I find that those concerns are still on my mind. As I think about my own children, I want my kids to be able to grow up to feel happy and fulfilled and to be healthy and well. And that's what all of us want as parents for our children. So I continue to work on these issues and to speak to these issues because I think it's still important. And I think regardless of what role we all play in life, whether we're in government or the private sector, or whether we're in the workplace or focusing on our families at home, I think we each have a role to play to start and drive a deeper conversation about what we need to shift in society so that more people can be happy, healthy, and fulfilled. Because the truth is, a lot of people aren't feeling that way right now.
When you were Surgeon General, you called loneliness an epidemic. And now I feel like that is kind of widely accepted. Back then, it was a bolder claim. What insight did you have early that led you to declare loneliness as a national epidemic?
Well, I had insights from my own lived experience. I had struggled a lot with loneliness as a kid and many times throughout my adult life. So I know how painful that felt and how deeply it affects a person. But I also was seeing loneliness in the patients that I cared for over the years. I never learned about loneliness in medical school or in residency training, but from the moment I set foot in the hospital and started really talking to patients, I just realized that so many of them were actually struggling with loneliness as well. And it would often have a real impact on their health in ways that even I could see. But it was when I became Surgeon General for my first term that I traveled the country and started talking to people and asked them the very basic question, which is, how can I help? And I tried to just sit back and do what I was taught in medical school, which is to listen as closely as you can to what people are telling you and try to understand not just what they're saying, but what's behind their words. And what I came to hear were just many, many stories of loneliness and isolation, and often from people I didn't expect it from college students who were surrounded by thousands of other students on campus and were posting things on social media that made it seem like they were happy and having a great time. Yet in quiet moments, they would confess that they were actually pretty isolated and they didn't feel like anybody really understood them. They couldn't really be themselves. And I was hearing this from parents who were surrounded by people all the time who felt like they had to carry life's burdens by themselves, from CEOs of companies, from folks really in all walks of life. And so that's what clued me into the fact that there was something happening here. And as I dug into the data and the research and the science around this, I found that not only did that confirm my suspicions that loneliness was in fact quite prevalent, with 1 in 2 youth and 1 in 3 adults struggling with loneliness in the United States, But it also helped me understand that loneliness was far more consequential for our health than I even realized, that it increases our risk of mental health concerns like depression, anxiety, and suicide. But it also significantly increases our risk of physical health ailments. Like I'm talking about a 29% increase in the rate of heart disease, a 32% increase in the rate of stroke, a 50% increase in the rate of dementia, and an overall impact on mortality, a life shortening impact that's comparable to smoking and to obesity. So, this is why loneliness became an issue I realized I needed to take on and raise the public awareness, because it was a public health issue just as important as any other that we may deal with.
Is loneliness acute to our era? Was there always loneliness and it just wasn't diagnosed, or has it gotten a lot worse because of social media or other variables?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I wish that we had data that had been collected for hundreds of years on this. So we'd been tracking this the way we track things like diabetes or high blood pressure in more recent years. But the truth is, we don't know how common loneliness was 100 years ago, 200 years ago. We have some indirect clues that tell us that loneliness has always been a human concern. It's written about in sort of books and biographies and historical accounts for generations ago. But what we do know is, if we look at more recent trends over the last few decades, here's what we see. We see that the amount of time that young people are spending with friends has been declining year after year after year. We see that the number of people who say that they have no friends that they can rely on has increased substantially over the last decade and a half. We also see that people's participation in the kind of organizations that used to bring us together and support community — I'm talking about faith organizations, recreational leagues, service organizations — participation has cratered in all of these organizations over the last half century. And finally, with technology, we hear time and time again about certainly the benefits of technology, the conveniences and efficiency can add to our life. But we're also seeing how it can further isolate us. We don't have to leave our home, for example, to buy something from the store anymore. We can order it online. We can get our groceries delivered to our doorstep. And as more and more people spend more time interfacing with others on social media, for example, all of that time spent takes away often from the time we have in person with others. And what we've done, I worry, is we've substituted higher quality in person interactions for lower quality online interactions. And the truth is that that is a trend that is leaving us, I believe, lonelier and less satisfied.
You spoke about how people are involved less in socializing organizations.
Yeah.
So the famous Robert Putnam Bowling Alone, and people are less involved in their faith-based organizations, et cetera. One organization that people are still involved in is companies,
Mm.
where people work. What is the role of leaders? What is the role of companies in creating more human connection? And kind of what should leaders, a lot of people who listen to this podcast are business leaders, and most of our guests come on talking about different leadership topics. So this is a little bit of a departure from our norm. But what is the role for leaders in creating connection and combating loneliness?
I'm glad you asked. And let me actually start with underscoring why it's so important to a business, to a company, or any organization to ensure that there's a high degree of social connection in your workforce. Because we have found over the years, in part through research done at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania, that when people in an organization feel disconnected from one another, that negatively affects their creativity, their productivity, and their engagement in the workplace. What we further found is that when people are disengaged in the workplace, that actually affects the people around them negatively. So if you are looking to enhance creativity and productivity in the workplace, if you want to ultimately do so in a way that contributes to retention in the workplace, then it's actually incumbent upon you to find ways to foster social connection in the workplace. Now, how do you do that? The traditional way that we used to do that, Will, was people would host company picnics or happy hours after work. And nothing wrong with those in and of themselves. But the challenge is they rarely get us as much connection as we hope they will. We often end up putting a whole bunch of people together in a room, hoping that they will connect. And the time that they are being asked to do that is often time they have to take away from their families and friends, or just from recuperating from work. And so this can be challenging. What I find is actually more helpful is actually to think about the following. Number one, as a leader, can you model a way of living that prioritizes relationships and friendships? This is something we worked hard to do in my office when I served in government. But we made sure, and I made sure to tell, folks that as important as our work was in the office, it was not their top priority in life, that their relationships with their family, with their close friends, was their priority. And if they needed to take time to be with a sick child, to be with their family, if they needed to not be available in evenings at times and be completely off of their computer, off of their inbox, so that they could spend the time with the people they loved, that was not only okay, but that was advisable. We encouraged people to do that. And it's one thing to say that. It's another thing, though, to demonstrate that and to model it. And that's what we had our senior leaders do. And so that's one thing that any leader can do to help build a culture of connection. But the second thing I'll mention is something that's going to be disarmingly simple, but it's very powerful in fostering connection, which is to use a little bit of time and a little bit of structure to create an opportunity for people to learn each other's stories in the workplace. Here's how we did it in my office. We had something my first term that we called our inside scoop exercise. It's a very simple exercise, but it involved 5 minutes during our weekly all hands meetings where we would ask one person to bring in pictures and to share them with the group. And the pictures could be of anything, in their life except, regarding their current job. So it could be pictures of their childhood from, a vacation they took recently, pictures of their family, whatever they wanted. And if this sounds familiar, by the way, it's because many of us did this in kindergarten. It's called show and tell. But what works for us actually as young children in terms of enabling us to connect with each other, that actually often works as adults too. And the need we have to connect as kids is just as strong when we're adults. And I'll tell you this, Will, the stories people shared in those 5 minutes were so powerful. We often felt that we came to understand more about a person and feel more deeply connected to them after those 5 minutes than we sometimes did spending a year working with them prior to that. One just story I'll mention to you that will always be in my mind is that of my aide de camp, Luis, who was part of our uniform service, a public health service, but who had served in the Marine Corps before he joined our service. And he would always say that he was a Marine through and through. And once a Marine, always a Marine was Luis's saying. And so we all assumed that when he came to the all hands meeting and it was his turn, that he'd bring in pictures of his time in the Marine Corps. That's not what he brought in. The pictures he brought in were of his mother and his father. And he told us that his father had died when Luis was younger. But he was an incredible musician. And every time Luis's children picked up an instrument, just to strum on the strings of a guitar or to try to blow into a trumpet, he could see his father's spirit living through them. And then he showed us the picture of his mother. And he said that his mother had largely raised him and his brother on her own, put them through school, put food on the table during really difficult times. And when he was in the Marine Corps, deployed on missions that were so dangerous that he didn't know if he was going to come back alive, when he felt that pit of fear rising in his stomach, the person that he would close his eyes and think of was his mother, because she was his picture of strength. I'll tell you, when we heard those stories about Luis, they humanized him in a completely different way. They helped us feel deeply connected to him in a way that we hadn't before. And that's the power of 5 minutes, a little bit of time and a little bit of structure. And after we did this exercise, even just a few weeks in, Will, we started to see that people were laughing together more, that they were stepping out of their lanes in work to help each other more when they saw someone who was struggling. And they seemed to be having a greater and better time at work. And that's all that we wanted, was for people to be able to enjoy their time at work, to do a good job at work, and to ultimately stick around. And that's what any workplace can help cultivate. So again, it's, I think, a really important imperative for leaders to think about strategic social connection as a strategic priority, which is what it is.
I love that. I think that the mindset shift from social connection is about creating social experiences like picnics or happy hours to modeling what living a social life is, creating space for your employees to similarly live a social life. and then creating these small, easy moments for people to bring their personal life into their professional world. And in doing so, really connecting one another a lot better. So thank you for that. You've inspired me. I'm going to, after this call, go on our team's channel and create a pets and kids channel and get people sharing photos and all that great stuff. So thank you.
It's wonderful.
So, on the topic of loneliness, I know one area that has really acute loneliness right now is loneliness among elderly people. Um, I'm curious for your take on AI companions and whether that is a possible way to combat loneliness. I have a friend who I live in San Francisco and I have tons of friends building startups. I have a friend who had a parent who is suffering from dementia, and they would just want to talk on the phone every single day for 30 minutes or so. And they would just ask the same questions over and over and over again. And my friend, who loves their dad more than anybody, really was struggling and actually built just a small bot to talk. And he was like, this feels so dystopian and I feel so guilty about it. And I know that my dad being able to spend 30 minutes on the phone talking to this, AI is actually something that is meaningful for him in his day. So yeah, how do you feel about AI companions to combat loneliness among elderly people?
Well, right now, AI companions are being used more broadly among not just the elderly, but by young people to actually address loneliness and foster connection. And part of the reason for this is that loneliness is actually the rates of loneliness are highest among young people. And right now, and we can talk more about this at some other point, but 75% of young people have actually used AI chatbots. And of those, actually, 1 in 8 say they do so because they have no one else that they can turn to for conversation. And nearly half of them say that they believe that whatever the chatbot tells them is likely to be true, which we've sadly seen is not always the case. So here is what I think AI chatbots can do. I think they can be an important source of information at times. I think sometimes they can be an important source of social nudges. And they can often focus, I think, when designed well, they can function as a social coach, if you will, and help nudge and push us to do things that actually may be beneficial for us, like reaching out to a friend or helping us figure out how to apologize after a fight that we had so that one fight doesn't become a year-long rift in a friendship. I think AI can be very, very helpful there. But where I'm more concerned, and I would say skeptical, is about whether AI can be a replacement for human beings. Here's, I think, where we start to run into real challenges. I think more broadly, when we think about friendships in our life, regardless of what age you are, I think friendships are important for us for a whole host of reasons. But strong friendships are not ones where your friend agrees with you all the time, tells you exactly what you want to hear, doesn't push back against you. But unfortunately, what we find often with AI chatbots, and this experience that many have had, is that they tend to conform to the user in the sense of they don't necessarily put up a whole lot of resistance. They tend to try to understand what you like and then augment that. And that can seem like a good thing in the short term. But that kind of sycophantic sort of behavior and patterns, if you will, ultimately does not serve us, as human beings. And what it does is what we realize is that some of that, occasional friction and the push and pull we have in friendships, they actually hone our social skills. They make us better people. They help us grow, and that enables us to better interact with and build relationships with other people, resolve conflicts at work, do all kinds of things. But one of the things I worry about is that, especially with the young people, we're seeing that social muscle has gotten weaker and weaker. And I don't think just trying to replace people with AI chatbots is actually going to serve people well, especially young people. Lastly, and let me just say about your friend in dementia. My grandmother just passed away a few months ago, and she struggled with dementia for years. And it was hard to see her go through that as somebody who, for my entire life, had been a very strong, independent woman who took care of everyone around her. But one of the things that was hard was we found that toward the end, with her short-term memory loss, she would often repeat herself, again and again. And I completely understand how that can be difficult for a family member and frustrating, can actually contribute to some of the burnout, because sometimes you want to be there for your loved one, you want to be compassionate, but everybody runs into sometimes a limit with their own energy level or their patience or whatever it might be. These are not easy circumstances, and I certainly don't in any way fault your friend or others for trying to think about how can technology be helpful to us, in these kind of circumstances. So I think it's important for us to explore technology as a solution. But I think the critical thing that we've always got to maintain is we have to ask ourselves the question, like, how do we ensure that the humanity that is central to relationships, how do we protect and preserve that? How do we ensure that we don't end up building technology that wholesale replaces human interaction and relationships? Because the end of that story, ultimately, if we play that out, is a world in which people are siloed in their homes, not just receiving their packages and groceries, but also having all of their social interactions with chatbots. And avoiding talking to real friends because it's hard, it's difficult, there may be conflict, it may be unpredictable, and that may seem dystopian, but the current scenario that we're seeing today would have been dystopian 5 years ago. A situation where three-quarters of young people are using AI chatbots, a scenario where some of the leaders of the largest technology companies in our country have said that they're going to solve loneliness by ensuring that everybody has an AI chatbot. That is not dystopia, that is reality today. And that's why we have to work very hard to ensure that technology does not rub out, edge out our humanity, that it augments our interaction but does not replace it.
High performance hinges on well being, not willpower. Franklin Covey's guide, Manage Your Energy to Do Your Job Well, shares actionable steps to help leaders and teams maintain focus, connection, and resilience amid constant change. Grab your free copy from the show notes to help your people fuel the fire and avoid burnout. You've now raised a couple of times the loneliness and mental health crisis among young people in particular. And I think a lot of people have pointed to social media as, I don't know, the singular problem, but as a huge part of the problem. And one who has gotten a lot of, along with you, been on the front lines kind of raising this issue is Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation. I'm curious what in the anxious generation you really believe in and agree with, and if then there's anything that you disagree with from kind of his telling of the problem.
Yeah, well, certainly I do know Jonathan. He's a friend. I'm familiar with his work, and we've talked, about these challenges over the years. But what I believe, a lot of what I believe, is what I put actually in the Surgeon General's advisory on social media and youth mental health that I published back in 2023. And the reason I did that, by the way, is because everywhere I went, the most common question that parents were asking me was about social media. And they asked me, is social media safe for my kids? And so I made a commitment that I was going to look at the data, understand what it showed us, and then share that with the public. And the two things that became abundantly clear in the review of the data was that, number one, there was not enough evidence for us to say that social media is safe for kids. That many of the other products kids use, by the way, whether it's medications, toys, you name it, are often assessed for safety, car seats, the cars themselves. Yet social media had not been subjected to rigorous and transparent safety evaluations that could assure a patient and a child that this medium was in fact safe for them. The second thing we found, though, was that there was growing evidence that social media was in fact associated with real harms. We found, for example, that young people who were on social media for 3.5 hours a day or more faced double the risk of anxiety and depression symptoms. And if you looked at the studies that were surveys of young people themselves, which are young people telling us what their concerns are, it turned out about a third of youth were saying that social media made them feel like they were addicted to the platforms. They're having a hard time getting off. Nearly half were saying that social media made them feel worse about their body image. And again, when young people are telling us these facts and these concerns, we have to listen. And that's what I heard, by the way, when I traveled all around the country and had roundtables and town halls with students in high schools and in colleges. They would even, unprompted, they would just volunteer the fact that one of the challenges they were facing from a mental health perspective was that when they went on their social media feeds and started scrolling through, they would often end up feeling worse about their lives, as they found themselves constantly comparing themselves to others. So I don't doubt that social media platforms began with the right intention in many cases, which was to ultimately build community. And this was the case perhaps 15 plus years ago. But somewhere along the way, driven by a business model that's based on advertising and that fundamentally became dependent on maximizing engagement, we ended up with platforms that ended up having young people comparing themselves to each other all the time. That became places where it became actually harder to be yourself, where the algorithm promoted a content that drove fear and anxiety because that ultimately drives engagement, which we know from human psychology. And that has turned out for many young people to not be a healthy place to be from a mental health perspective. So my view of this is not that technology is bad. It's not that there's no version of social media that could be useful for people. But what we need to do is to ultimately ensure that we are building technology that again supplements and our human relationships, but is not seek to replace them. And right now, many young folks I talk to who are high school students and college students, they are aware of the fact that their social muscle has gotten weak and in some cases never really fully developed. I was at a college just a few weeks ago and they said the word they used to describe the feeling of walking into the lunchroom, the cafeteria, and potentially having to sit next to a stranger was they said it was terrifying. Terrifying. This is like an experience that many of us thought perhaps growing up we should all have to experience and learn to deal with. But for many people, it's actually really hard right now. So this is why I think one of the things that we need is we need a generation of technology entrepreneurs who are committed to building and developing technology that will strengthen humanity, that will help strengthen our social connection to each other, that will ultimately help our health and well-being. It's what I encouraged people to do when I was Surgeon General, and now as a private citizen. I work hard to support entrepreneurs through a venture fund that I'm a part of, as an angel investor, as a mentor whenever I can. And I seek to speak about these issues as often as I can, because I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs out there who want to do the right thing, who want to help solve the big problems we're facing in society, including loneliness and isolation. And I think this is a time where we have to identify, support them, and get them the resources that they need.
Hmm. Are you in favor of a social media ban for people under some age? I think Europe, a lot of countries are doing under 16. Australia. Do you think we should have a similar ban in the US?
Well, I think until social media is proven to be safe for kids, I don't think it makes sense for us to allow the wholesale use of this without any safety guardrails. So when I look at countries like Australia that have put a restriction on social media for kids who are under 16, I think that's a very reasonable step to take. And my wish for the United States is that our legislators would step up and fulfill their responsibility to kids and to families and actually put in place the safeguards that are going to protect our kids from the harmful effects of social media that we've already seen in the data and continue to see more of. And my worry is that to this point, at a federal level, our legislators have failed to do that. And I think in doing so, they have failed kids and they have failed families.
So obviously you were a Surgeon General in the Biden administration, the Obama administration. We now have the Trump administration. And I think you did a lot of work to take some of these social issues and bring them to the forefront. Now you have RFK in the MAHA movement that's kind of picking a whole new set of issues that they're focused on. What of the MAHA movement do you actually agree with? And then what do you disagree with the most?
Well, one of the things I think that's very important that we have not done enough of in our country is to talk about food and how to ensure that the food supply in our country is healthy and affordable for everyone. Food is one of the most important building blocks for our health and well-being. Food affects everything from our physical health to our mental health and well-being. It's essential. Yet, I worry that over the decades, we have allowed our food supply to become increasingly enriched for ultra processed foods. Those foods end up being the cheapest and the most accessible. And that's why you have a scenario where 2/3 of the diet of the average child in America is ultra processed food, and about half of the average diet of the average American adult is ultra processed food. That is a place where I certainly hope that the Secretary of HHS and his team will continue to focus more and more on, because I think it's absolutely essential. I don't think can't keep up, I should say, with the level of chronic disease that we have in our country, diabetes, high blood pressure, dementia, without doing something about the upstream causes, and that includes food. I do think the one area where it's important for us to really double down and focus on, an area that I'm really concerned about right now, is we have to make sure that the approaches that we take to everything from food to vaccines are based in science and in evidence, that they're based in also in a process that's transparent. We have vaccines that have helped save lives, millions of lives around the world, whether those are the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, the polio vaccines. And just because we have been blessed to be able to grow up, many of us, in an era where those illnesses were far less common because of vaccination, that doesn't mean we can assume that those illnesses were harmful. You just, or harmless rather. You just need to talk to people who are alive during the area of polio and who have lived through major measles outbreaks to just understand how profoundly dangerous these have been for individuals and their families. And so that's a place where I do worry that we are not going in the right direction. I think we need to make sure that people have access to vaccines. We need to keep vaccines that have saved lives like on the vaccine schedule, make sure that families know what the science says about their help and their utility. And we also have to make sure that the people who have studied these vaccines with rigorous science and have published, about this in peer-reviewed journals, the people who have subjected their work to scrutiny from the scientific, sort of professionals who have trained in research methods, we have to make sure that their point of view is given voice to. It has to be done transparently. It has to be done in a way that people can understand. But we've got to, this is a time when we're seeing more and more health threats where we should be valuing expertise. We should be keeping the tools that have worked with us, and those include vaccines, while seeking to take on threats that we haven't done nearly enough on, like the food supply.
Before we move to our lightning round and come to a close, I want to ask you about what's next. So we've talked a lot about your past and about loneliness, about mental health for youth, and you've referenced a couple of things, venture capital fund and angel investing and whatnot, but what's next for you?
Well, so, I still care deeply about the issues that I focused on when I was in office. I care deeply about how we rebuild the social fabric of our country and build more social connection. I care about getting to the root causes of what's driving this sense of emptiness and lack of fulfillment that too many people feel, especially young people today. I want to do something about that. And so, in addition to supporting entrepreneurs, building technology solutions for well-being, I'm also spending time today these days working on something called the Together Project, which is a project that we have launched to try to focus on these deeper elements of well-being that include social connection, but that also include service and purpose. Those three elements, by the way, relationships, purpose, and service, these three elements I think of as a triad of fulfillment. They're what enable us, despite hardship and adversity that we may face, to find a sense of hope, to be grounded, to have a sense of peace in our lives. And that's ultimately what we all need. My worry right now is that triad of fulfillment has often been edged out in many people's lives. I would often ask young people when I traveled how they define success. What they would often tell me is that success in life that they felt was rooted in three other things in a different triad, and that was money, power, and fame. They didn't always believe that that was going to make them happy, but they felt that that's what society was telling them. That's what they saw from influencers online, and they didn't want to get left behind. So they rolled up their sleeves and they worked hard to figure out how they could accrue more money, more fame, and more power. Now, there's nothing wrong with money, fame, or power in and of themselves. But the problem I have found is when we make the assumption, I believe the incorrect assumption, that those three are the key to our lasting fulfillment. And I suspect, Will, you and I both know many people who are rich, powerful, and famous, but who are profoundly unhappy and who don't have a sense of purpose, who don't have rich relationships in their life, who aren't engaged in serving others in the way that we all need to be engaged in. So this is the work that to me is very important. And there are a bunch of ways that we're looking to approach this. I'm looking to, through the Together Project, we're looking to support folks who are building community, in a small scale and help them figure out how they can do that, in a more sustainable way and at scale. We're also launching a podcast and a Substack called Staying Human, which is focused on the idea of helping people anchor in these core elements that keep us human, particularly our relationships, at a time where so much around us is often pulling us away from each other and can often feel dehumanizing. And so these are some of the ways that, that I'm going to be working on this issue. I'm particularly excited about the podcast because I had a podcast when I was in office, and the conversations we had through the podcast were some of the most fulfilling conversations that I had. So I'm excited to be able to bring together people who have thought deeply about the issue of fulfillment and how we navigate our really messy lives, find that path of fulfillment, help each other on that path and ultimately live a life that we can feel really, really good
Wonderful. It's great to hear that you're joining the podcasting crew.
about.
That's perfect. You'll be great. I'm sure you were great before as well. All right, so let's move to the lightning round. A couple of quick closing questions. So, Wall Surgeon General, you published Recipes for Connection, which was a series of essays and recipes encourage people to gather over food. You even hosted potlucks with famous chefs. If you and your wife hosted Barack and Michelle for dinner, which maybe you actually have done, I don't know. If you hosted them for dinner, what would you cook?
I would make them it would be an Indian dish. It would be, there's a sort of a curry lentil dish, if you will, that I would make for them. And then for dessert, I would make something that's was a childhood favorite of mine that my mother always used to make. It's a sweet called ras malai. And so those are the two things that I would make for them. Yeah. I'm not saying that they would
Okay,
necessarily
sounds
like it. I'm not saying I'm a great cook. That's what I would make.
lovely. What is a book that you find yourself recommending regularly?
That's a great question. Mm, well, there's a book called The Alchemist, which I love. It's a very short book, but it's a story about a quest that a young man goes on. And it's really not just a quest to figure out what to do in terms of work, but a quest about meaning and fulfillment in life. I found that to be really helpful as a book for me and a source of instruction when I was going through medical school. And I recommend that often. There's one other that book that I recommend often, which changed my life at that same time, and it was called Conversations with God, and it was written by a guy named Neil Donald Walsh. I was from Chicago, and Neil Donald Walsh was a man whose life fell apart one day. Work fell apart, his relationships fell apart. He was all alone, and it's about how he found his way back. And it turns out to have been through this really extraordinary conversation that he had, which he calls a conversation with God. So regardless of whether you're a person of faith or not, like regardless of what faith you belong to, it doesn't really matter. Like the lessons contained there, the insights, I found to be universal truths that still speak to me today.
Wonderful. One of my favorite teachers gave me The Alchemist when I graduated from high school
Oh,
before going to college. So I have read that one. I have not read Conversations with God, so I'll add that to my reading list.
okay.
And final question for you. If you had a billboard that everybody in America had to drive by, what would you write on that billboard?
Uh, I might write something like, let's see, the billboard would say, "Life is short, be kind." I think so many times that we spend time yelling at people either on the screen or on the road. We condemn people, after we see what they're saying on TV. We see all of these. We have a lot of negative energy that we put out when it comes to how we treat others, and sometimes that's deserved, sometimes it's not. But one thing I have realized is that there are a lot of situations in life where sometimes we have to give people the benefit of the doubt. We don't always know what's happening in their life. Somebody cuts us off in traffic, for example. We don't know if they're trying to get to the hospital because their kid is sick. We just don't know what's happening in people's lives. I've realized I have snapped at people sometimes when I've been really stressed about something. And I've been blessed that sometimes people have not lashed back at me, but have paused and thought maybe something's going on in his life. So people have been kind to me. I've tried to remember to be kind to others. And that's the currency that we need more and more in the world right now, because we can't survive a world where people are getting meaner and more cynical. We need more kindness. We need more love. We need more optimism. So that's what I believe.
I love that. So our typical closing question, Frank Covey is a leadership company. And so who is a great leader who you have worked with, and what lesson can we all take from them?
Oh, that's a great question. One of the best leaders that I worked with was my program director from my residency training. His name is Joel Katz. And Joel was responsible for 150 so residents who were, you know, coming out of medical school, trying to figure out how to become doctors, dealing with crazy life transitions, working crazy hours, and seeing extraordinarily difficult human circumstances, including death, and having to manage all of that. But what really struck me about him as a leader is that he modeled the culture that he wanted all of us to be a part of. He wanted people to be kind to each other. He wanted people to reach out and help each other, recognizing we're all going to struggle at some point. in our training. And he wanted us to enjoy each other's company as well, recognizing that the bonds we built with each other were what will sustain us throughout our training. And that's what he did for us too. Like when I remember one day people were unhappy with the food that was being provided at lunch, and he just made it his mission to just change that and make sure. You might think of all the things a program director has to worry about. Really, is it the food? At the noon conference, but he recognized this is important to people. Whenever there was a circumstance where somebody had a death in the family or they were ill themselves, Joel would step up and personally make sure that they got the medical care that they needed. Whenever we had get-togethers, Joel would either show up or would try in some way to contribute financially to paying for it, recognizing we were all broke residents. Um, in his own small ways, not looking for credit, not looking for awards, he led by example and showing us that it is possible to work incredibly hard, do extraordinarily important work that's high stress while still building a culture of kindness, support, and love. So Joel Katz is one of the leaders that I look up to in my life.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I hope that when this podcast comes out, I hope you share it with Joel, and it'll probably make his week, if not his year, to hear you speaking so kindly of him. So thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. I thought it was fascinating hearing more of your experience and more of your insights and your prescriptions for combating loneliness. I know you're going to be starting your own podcast. And so I guess starting again, I'm sure you'll be incredible at it. You also have a voice for podcasting. So it will be a very relaxing, soothing listen. But in all seriousness, thank you so much for joining today. It was wonderful to have you on the conversation.
Thanks so much, Will. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the good wishes as well. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Wonderful. To everybody listening, thank you so much for spending another week with us at Franklin Covey. And please join us next week for another episode of Franklin Covey on Leadership, and share this podcast with somebody who you think would really benefit from this insight and wisdom. Have a wonderful rest of your week.